On a rainy night in Brookhaven, a young black mother cradling her newborn found herself cornered by flashing lights and snarling police dogs. But what those officers didn't know was that Serena Cole once commanded war dogs in deserts halfway across the world. What happened next will leave you stunned. Watch till the end, then subscribe, hit that like button, and share this story so more people hear the truth. The rain in Brookhaven had started as a whisper, a soft drizzle tapping gently on rooftops and dripping from the edges of white picket fences. But by the time Serena Cole stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, clutching her newborn son Malik against her chest, the drizzle had grown into a steady curtain of water, soaking the quiet town in sheets of silver. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to keep out the chill. It was just past 9 o'clock at night, the kind of hour when most houses glowed warmly from the inside with the blue light of televisions, while the streets outside lay abandoned, still expectant. And yet, Serena felt it, that subtle tightening in the air, that sensation. That eyes lingered on her longer than they should, that whispers floated just a second too loud behind curtained windows. She had walked this road dozens of times before. Brookhaven was no metropolis. It was the kind of small American town that prided itself on order, where church bells rang on Sunday mornings, where neighbors trimmed their lawns to exact symmetry, where parents claimed their children could still ride bikes past sundown without fear. But tonight, every familiar corner felt altered darker somehow, as though the rain had peeled away the town's charm and revealed something sharper underneath. Her feet splashed against shallow puddles each step, carrying the weight not just of her body, but of the fragile heartbeat she carried in her arms. Malik, barely 2 weeks old, whimpered against her chest, his tiny fists pressing weakly into the fabric of his blanket. Serena adjusted her pace, rocking him gently, as she walked, whispering soft assurances that were more for her own spirit than his. She had fought battles in deserts halfway across the world, but nothing had ever pressed down on her soul like this gnawing sense that she didn't belong, that no matter her sacrifices, no matter her service, the world she had returned to refused to see her as anything more than an intruder in its neatly painted picture. A porch light flicked on ahead, spilling gold across the wet pavement. A silhouette moved behind the curtains of a tidy home. She thought she heard the faint scrape of a door unlocking before it quickly snapped shut again, as though the very sight of her, a drenched black woman carrying a baby, was reason enough to retreat. The weight of that silent rejection pressed heavier than the rain soaking her clothes. Serena pulled Malik closer, tucking his head under her chin. He smelled of powder and warmth, a reminder that she had something worth every fight, every sacrifice, every ounce of her strength. Her heart pounded louder than the rain. She knew the sound of suspicion when she felt it. It was the same pulse that had hummed through foreign streets when danger lingered just out of sight. It was the same tension in the air before an ambush, the same heat in the chest when trust could collapse in a heartbeat. Her steps slowed. She scanned the street the way she used to scan alleys in Kabul, eyes darting between shadows and lamplight. For a moment, she almost laughed at herself. This was Brookhaven, not a battlefield. But the laughter never came. Instead, headlights flared in the distance, piercing through the veil of rain growing larger with each passing second. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its engine humming low, its tires spitting water from the pavement. Serena's breath caught. She told herself it was nothing. A patrol car on a wet night, nothing more. She shifted Malik slightly, pressing her lips to his damp forehead, whispering, "Almost home, baby." But as the cruiser slowed, its lights dimming to a crawl beside her, she knew This wasn't coincidence. This was attention. The car rolled past her for just a moment, its window cracked open, and she felt it. The weight of eyes studying her, dissecting her presence, questioning her right to exist on this street at this hour. Her pulse quickened. She turned her gaze straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge them, focusing instead on the warm glow of her small apartment building a block away. But then, another set of headlights appeared behind her. Another cruiser. Its red and blue lights flickered briefly, cutting sharp beams through the curtain of rain. The sound of Malik's soft cries grew louder, more urgent, as though he too could sense the shift in the air. Serena's throat tightened. She stopped walking for a moment, her boots planted firmly on the slick pavement, her body stiffening the way it had once stiffened during drills when an officer barked commands across a field. But this wasn't training. This was supposed to be home. And yet, the hostility in the night pressed against her chest, with the same suffocating force as war zones half a world away. The first cruiser braked ahead of her, its tires hissing against the wet road. The second slowed behind her, boxing her in. She stood in the narrow corridor of rain between them, her heart hammering so loudly she thought the officers might hear it when they stepped out. Malik shifted, whimpering his small cries, cutting through the storm like fragile echoes of innocence. Serena closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, remembering the sound of helicopters roaring above desert sands, the way her boots had sunk into scorching earth, the way she had steadied her voice to calm a dog that could smell fear before any human could. The memories came unbidden, a rush of past bleeding into present, reminding her that fear was a weapon if she let it consume her, but resolve could bend even the fiercest storms. She opened her eyes, shoulders squared, though the rain plastered her hair against her face and soaked the blanket wrapped around her child. Two silhouettes emerged from the cruiser ahead, heavy boots splashing in puddles, belts heavy with weapons and suspicion. Another pair of doors slammed behind her footsteps approaching. Serena didn't move. She couldn't not with Malik pressed against her, not with danger closing in from both directions. The rain seemed to fall harder in that instant, drumming against metal pavement skin. The small town of Brookhaven, with its quiet streets and polite facades, had transformed into something else entirely, a stage where truth would clash with perception, where survival depended not on running, but on standing firm. And as Serena Cole stood there, a 32-year-old veteran, a mother, a woman carved by battles both foreign and domestic, she understood the cruel irony of her situation. She had risked her life in deserts, where she was told she fought for freedom, only to come home to a street where her very existence was seen as threat. She was not running from crime. She was guilty of nothing but breathing in a place that had already decided she didn't belong. With her son's heartbeat pressing against her chest, Serena braced herself. Because somewhere deep inside, she knew the quiet night was over. And what came next would test not just her strength, but the limits of a system that had mistaken her silence for weakness. The rain hammered the narrow street of Brookhaven, as if the heavens themselves wanted to wash the night clean. But the storm only deepened the weight, pressing against Serena Cole's chest. One cruiser had stopped in front of her, blocking the path to her apartment a block away. The other idled behind her headlights, glaring into her back, like unblinking eyes trapping her in a corridor of suspicion. It was no accident. She was boxed in the street, transformed from a route home into a cage. Her breath came shallow, steadying itself against the rhythm of the rainfall. Malik, barely 2 weeks old, whimpered softly against her chest, his tiny fists clutching at the blanket, as if he sensed the danger before her words could ever name it. Serena's instincts sharpened, the same instincts that had kept her alive in deserts, where every shadow might hide an ambush. Only this time, There were no sandstorms, no insurgents. Just a small-town street in America, and men who wore badges but carried suspicion in their eyes like a loaded weapon. The cruiser ahead hissed as its door opened. A man stepped out, Officer Harris. His boots splashed into a puddle water, leaping in arcs around his legs. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way predators circle prey. His hand hovered near the holster on his belt, not gripping it fully, but never straying far, the silent suggestion that power was his to wield at any second. His gaze swept over Serena, then dipped to the bundle in her arms. He didn't soften at the sight of a newborn. Instead, his jaw clenched tighter as though Malik's presence was nothing but another layer of suspicion. Behind her, another door slammed. Officer Doyle approached heavier in build, his steps loud against the wet pavement. His flashlight beam cut through the rain, landing directly on Serena's face. The light was harsh, unflinching, forcing her to squint, to stand frozen in its glare. He tilted his head, studying her as if she were an intruder in her own town, as if the rain-soaked woman clutching her child was not a mother returning home, but a threat demanding confrontation. "Ma'am," Harris said, his voice clipped, measured, more command than courtesy. "Where are you headed tonight?" Serena didn't answer right away. Not because she didn't know, but because she understood the trap in his words. Answer too quickly, and it sounded rehearsed. Pause too long, and it sounded evasive. She adjusted Malik slightly, whispering to him in a hush meant only for his ears before meeting Harris's gaze. "Home," she said evenly. Her voice didn't tremble, though her heart pounded like a drum. "Home," Doyle echoed from behind her, his tone laced with doubt, as if the concept of home was foreign to her. The beam of his flashlight slid down her jacket, lingering on the thin fabric soaked through by rain, then caught on Malik's tiny face as the baby shifted. The light was too bright for a newborn's eyes, and Serena angled her body instinctively, shielding him with her shoulder. The officers exchanged a glance. To anyone else it might have seemed casual, but Serena recognized it instantly. In her years as a soldier, she had seen men share looks just like that in combat zones, silent agreements, unspoken cues that something was about to happen. "Let's see some ID," Harris demanded, stepping closer. His boots splashed into another puddle, sending water spraying against Serena's jeans. Her throat tightened. She thought of her wallet tucked inside her small shoulder bag, but to reach for it meant shifting Malik, exposing him to the cold rain, fumbling in front of men whose hands already hovered too close to their weapons. The trap tightened. "Why?" she asked softly, though the weight in her tone cut through the rain. Doyle's laugh was short, humorless. "Why? Because you don't just wander these streets this late at night not carrying a baby like that. Doesn't look right." The words hit her harder than the rain. Doesn't look right. A phrase she had heard too many times in too many forms. In stores where clerks watched her longer than any other customer. In job interviews where smiles thinned as soon as her resume was set against the color of her skin. And now, here on the street, she had walked countless nights before those words pressed against her like a verdict. Her muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at her to prepare. Not for attack, she wouldn't let herself think of that yet, but for the unfolding of something she had prayed would never happen on her own doorstep. She shifted Malik again, pressing her lips to his damp forehead. He quieted at her touch, his cries dissolving into soft whimpers, though his tiny chest still rose and fell with uneven breaths. "ID," Harris repeated sharper this time. Serena's mind raced. The rain blurred the world around her, headlights gleaming like false stars through the storm. She knew that if she reached too fast, they could claim she posed a threat. If she hesitated too long, they could claim she was resisting. Every option was laced with danger. In the silence that stretched, Doyle stepped closer from behind. She could feel his presence now, the way soldiers feel the hum of an unseen enemy behind cover. His flashlight beam slid down to her shoes, then back up, dissecting every inch of her. "What's in the blanket?" Doyle asked suddenly, his voice sharp suspicion dripping from each syllable. Her blood froze. "What's in the blanket?" As if Malik's tiny movements, his soft cries were not enough proof of life. As if her baby was contraband, not a child. Rage flared hot in her chest, but she swallowed it down, knowing anger was the very fuel they wanted to ignite. "It's my son," she said firmly, her voice steady as stone. The officers didn't flinch at her words. Harris's hand twitched near his holster. Doyle's flashlight beam lingered on the outline of Malik's face. They weren't convinced. Or maybe they didn't want to be. Because in their eyes, her motherhood wasn't innocence, it was inconvenience. The rain poured harder, the storm swelling into a roar around them. Serena stood at the center of it, all soaked to the bone, her body a shield around her son. And in that moment, she realized the trap wasn't just the cruisers boxing her in. It was the system itself, a system that had already decided who she was before she ever spoke a word. Her heart pounded faster, instincts from another life surging forward. She remembered the feel of a leash in her hand, the bark of commands echoing across desert fields, the sharp discipline of dogs trained to respond not to fear, but to presence. Those instincts stirred now, warning her that this night was about to tip into something far more dangerous than a request for ID. Because the officers weren't satisfied with suspicion alone. She saw it in their eyes, in the subtle shifts of their stances. They wanted escalation. They wanted control. And Serena, standing drenched in the rain with her newborn pressed to her chest, knew with chilling certainty that the confrontation had only just begun. The rain fell in relentless sheets, drowning the silence between Serena and the two officers who circled her like wolves, debating how best to strike. Officer Harris narrowed his eyes, one hand still hovering near his holster, the other flicking toward the back seat of his cruiser. It was a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for nothing, but Serena's instincts caught it instantly. She had seen men signal ambushes with less. The door to the cruiser clicked open, hinges groaning against the storm, and from the shadows inside came a sound that split the night like a blade, the deep guttural snarl of a canine. The dog's growl rolled low and thunderous, vibrating against the wet pavement as its paws struck the ground. Its leash stretched tight as Officer Harris gripped it, the animal's muscles coiled teeth flashing white under the reflection of the headlights. Droplets of rain slid from its muzzle, dripping onto the pavement as its eyes locked onto Serena. To Harris and Doyle, the canine was a weapon, a tool of fear, designed to shred compliance from anyone too slow to obey. To them, this moment was leverage the dog, nothing more than muscle and teeth on command. But, to Serena Cole, the sound pierced far deeper. It wasn't terror that clenched her stomach, it was recognition. In an instant, the storm around her blurred into memory, and she was no longer standing on a soaked street in Brookhaven. She was crouched in the burning sands of Kandahar, the desert wind whipping grit into her eyes. She could hear the roar of helicopters above, the echo of shouted commands, the sharp bark of a German shepherd straining at her side. That guttural growl wasn't just a threat. It was the language of survival, one she had spoken fluently for years. Serena shifted Malik higher against her chest, her palm shielding his tiny head from the rain. The baby whimpered softly, the fragile sound nearly drowned out by the canine's snarls. Harris smirked, mistaking her adjustment for weakness. To him, she was exactly what he wanted her to be, a cornered mother, vulnerable moments away from begging. His grip tightened on the leash. "You're gonna listen now," Harris barked over the rain voice, sharp, with the thrill of control. The dog jerked forward, claws scraping the wet pavement, lunging so close Serena could feel the spray of water flung from its paws. The animal's teeth snapped inches from her leg, held back only by the taut leash. Malik cried out, his voice breaking into a wail that cut through the storm. Serena's heart clenched, not from fear of the animal, but from fury at the scene unfolding her newborn's first weeks of life, marked not by lullabies, but by the sound of police dogs snapping at his mother's skin. Doyle chuckled from behind her, a sound that slithered with arrogance. Scared yet, he taunted, circling so that his flashlight beam sliced across Serena's soaked face. "Doesn't look like you belong here, does it, baby, or not?" The words burned. She had heard them before, though never spoken so plainly. "Doesn't look like you belong." That was the verdict stamped across her life, across the color of her skin, across the silence that greeted her when she hung up her uniform for the last time and tried to step back into the world she had fought to protect. But fear was not what rose inside her now. It was muscle memory sharpened by years of training discipline, ingrained so deeply it became instinct. She steadied her breathing, lowered her shoulders, and let her eyes lock onto the canines. For the briefest of seconds, her surroundings melted away. It was no longer Harris holding the leash, no longer Doyle taunting in the shadows. It was just her and the dog, handler and hound, a language deeper than words. She remembered the first time she had been handed a leash in the military, the weight of it like a lifeline in her palm. She remembered the nights spent whispering commands in German to an animal whose loyalty had saved her platoon more times than bullets ever could. She remembered crouching in crumbled ruins, her heart pounding as insurgents moved in the distance, and the steady, grounded presence of a dog at her side, ready to obey, ready to protect. The growl in front of her now was no different. The animal's snarled teeth bared, but behind the ferocity, she heard hesitation, a flicker of recognition only a handler could notice. She raised her chin slightly, eyes never leaving the dog's, and in that subtle lift that measured calm, she spoke without sound. "I know you. I've been where you've been. I command, not cower." The leash rattled as Harris yanked it back, mistaking the dog's brief pause for stubbornness. "Get her!" He snapped, his voice slicing through the rain. He shoved the animal forward, expecting obedience, expecting terror to explode from Serena's body like shrapnel. Instead, the opposite happened. Serena dropped to one knee, shielding Malik with her left arm, her right hand rising slowly. Not in surrender, but in a gesture so precise, so deliberate, that every muscle in her body remembered its purpose. The dog lunged, but at the sight of her hand, at the shift in her posture, it faltered mid-stride. Its growl turned uncertain, caught between the harsh command of Harris and the quiet authority radiating from Serena. Rain dripped from its muzzle as it stopped just short of her claws, scraping against pavement, body trembling with confusion. Harris cursed, jerking the leash angrily, shouting louder, his voice cracking with the frustration of a man watching his power slip through his fingers. Doyle shouted too, ordering Serena to get on her knees, to drop her baby, to comply. But she didn't move. She didn't beg. She let the silence between her and the animal speak louder than their rage. Malik's cries softened, as if even he could sense the shift. Serena whispered something into his ear, words not in English, but in the same clipped foreign tongue she had once used in deserts under fire. The dog's ears twitched, its growl wavered, and for a moment, a long, trembling moment, it lowered its head not to strike, but to wait, to listen. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a blaze of white. Harris's face twisted in disbelief, Doyle's jaw clenched in anger, and Serena rose from her knee. Malik pressed firmly against her chest. Her eyes never left the dog's, and the dog never moved against her. To the officers, this was defiance. To Serena, it was survival. But more than that, it was revelation. They had unleashed their weapon confident it would break her. Instead, it had reminded her of who she was, of the battlefield she had carried within her bones, of the authority she still commanded, even drenched in rain, even branded guilty by the color of her skin. The trap was tightening, yes, but so was her resolve. Because if one dog could hesitate under her gaze, what came next would shake far more than their leashes. The storm in Brookhaven blurred into memory, its pounding rain dissolving into the whirl of desert winds. For a moment, as Serena Cole held her ground before the snarling police dog, she was no longer standing on a soaked street corner with her newborn pressed against her chest. She was thousands of miles away, years earlier, wearing fatigues that clung to her skin with heat and dust. Her boots weren't splashing in puddles, but sinking into sand. The roar around her wasn't thunder, but helicopters slicing through blistering skies. And at her side, tethered by a leash she had learned to trust more than her own rifle, was a German shepherd whose growl was not a threat, but a promise: I will protect you as long as you protect me. Serena had been 22 when she joined the military, a young woman searching for something greater than the narrow boxes the world tried to force her into. They told her she was too fragile, too soft, too quiet to handle the kind of dogs bred for war. But she proved them wrong in the first week of training. She remembered that day with startling clarity, the long rows of kennels, the smell of sawdust and disinfectant, the bark and snap of teeth against chain-link fences. Dozens of recruits had flinched, stepping back when the first dogs lunged. Serena hadn't. She had stood steady, locking eyes with the snarling shepherd before her. And in that gaze, she had seen not savagery, but discipline, waiting for direction. When the trainer handed her the leash, her hand hadn't trembled. By the end of her training, she had learned commands not only in English, but in clipped German syllables that rolled off her tongue like second nature. Sitz, sit, fass, bite, aus, release. Each word was a key that unlocked precision inside the animal, transforming muscle and teeth into control, chaos into order. She had studied their body language the way soldiers studied maps, ears twitching, tails stiffening, pupils narrowing. To the untrained eye, a dog was a weapon. To Serena, it was a soldier, a partner, a heartbeat that synchronized with hers. Her first deployment had been Afghanistan. The memory slammed into her chest as vividly as the rain now pelting her shoulders. She could still feel the weight of 80 pounds of gear strapped to her body, the rifle digging into her shoulder, the leash wrapped around her gloved palm. The air was hot enough to burn thick with sand that stuck to every breath. She and her dog Ranger, a black and tan shepherd with a scar across his muzzle, were tasked with clearing routes for her unit. Mines could be buried anywhere, roadside bombs waiting like ghosts beneath the dirt. Every step was a gamble, but Ranger's nose was sharper than any machine. She remembered crouching, whispering encouragement as he sniffed the earth, his ears' flicking tail stiffening when danger lurked inches below their boots. More than once his alerts had saved lives, halting soldiers seconds before they would have stepped into oblivion. There were nights, 2 nights, when the desert air dropped to bone-chilling cold, when gunfire erupted in alleys that twisted like mazes. Serena had knelt behind crumbling walls, bullets cracking overhead, whispering to Ranger in the same low tone she now used with her infant son. She had commanded him not with fear, but with calm, sending him forward into shadows to flush out threats no human could reach. and every time he returned his flank, brushing against her leg, she felt the weight of survival settle between them. They were more than handler and hound. They were a team stitched together by trust no enemy could sever. She remembered the day her unit had been ambushed, the memory sharper than any scar. It was just after dawn, the air hazy with dust from a convoy of trucks rumbling down a narrow road. Shots rang out deafening cracks, ricocheting against the cliffs. Soldiers dove for cover, shouting over the chaos. Serena's ears rang, but her grip on Ranger's leash tightened. She had dropped low, shielding him with her body, even as bullets struck stone inches from her head. Bleeb she had commanded stay. His body froze, every muscle rigid with obedience, even as the world exploded around them. And when the order came to move to push forward, she whispered again. Steady as stone and Ranger surged into the storm, sniffing out threats leading men who had once doubted her to safety they would never have found without him. Her chest ached at the memory, not just from pride, but from the hollow silence that followed. War had taken Ranger from her in the end, a blast sudden and merciless during their second tour. She remembered the weight of him in her arms, blood soaking her fatigues, his eyes locked on hers until the light faded. The army had thanked her with medals and paperwork, with a folded flag, but not with answers for how to live when the only creature that had trusted her without hesitation was gone. She had carried that loss back home, buried it under civilian clothes, pretending the leash no longer burned against her palm. But the truth was simple. The war never left her. The commands still lived in her tongue, the instincts still pulsed in her muscles. She could read a dog's hesitation like most people read words on a page. She could steady her voice in chaos when others crumbled. The battlefield had carved discipline into her bones, and though the world refused to see it, refused to see her, that strength had never gone. And now, standing in the rain-soaked street of Brookhaven that past collided with her present. The police dog snarling before her wasn't Ranger, but the recognition was undeniable. Its ears twitched, the same way its body trembled at the same crossroad between command and instinct. Harris thought the leash in his hand gave him control, but Serena knew better. Control wasn't about force. It was about presence, about trust, about commanding respect, without needing to shout. She pressed Malik closer, whispering in the same low cadence she had once used under fire. The sound steadied her heartbeat, aligned her breaths with the rhythm of memory. She wasn't just a mother drenched in rain, cornered by flashing lights. She was a decorated military dog handler, a woman who had faced mine's bullets and death itself, and walked away stronger. Harris and Doyle thought they were the predators. They thought their snarling animal would reduce her to prey. But they had no idea that what stood before them wasn't helplessness. It was history reborn. The war was behind her, yes. The uniform folded away, the medals tucked into a box that collected dust in her closet. But the training, the instincts, the unshakable authority, those had never left. And on this night, under this storm, with her newborn's heartbeat pressed against hers, they were about to rise again, sharper and stronger than ever. The rain beat harder against the pavement, each drop exploding like shrapnel across the narrow street. Serena Cole stood rooted in place, her breath steady, her body taut with the memory of deserts and battlefields that had never left her. Officer Harris's hand twitched at the leash, his smirk widening as though he could already taste her submission. Then, with a snap of impatience and arrogance, he unclamped the metal clasp. The leash slipped free. The canine exploded forward like a bullet released from its chamber. Its paws tore at the wet ground, claws scraping as it lunged, a wall of fur and muscle surging toward Serena. Its teeth gleamed under the fractured glare of the headlights, water streaming from its muzzle as its snarled jaws spread wide. To Harris, it was the moment he had orchestrated the dog as a weapon, the mother as prey, the show of force, meant to crush her spirit. But to Serena, it was the moment everything sharpened. Her training rose from the marrow of her bones, instinct honed by years where hesitation meant death. She dropped to one knee in the rain, her body curving protectively over Malik, who whimpered against her chest. Her left arm shielded his tiny head, while her right hand rose, not high, not frantic, but with surgical precision. Palm-flat fingers firm her motion, cut cleanly through the storm, not in surrender, but in command. And in that split second the impossible happened. The dog skidded mid-stride water, spraying beneath its paws. Its growl faltered, vibrating into uncertainty. Its body trembled with the force of its own momentum, torn between the brutality of Harris's shouted order and the unspoken authority radiating from Serena's gesture. Its ears twitched, its eyes locked with hers, and in that silent collision something ancient stirred a recognition that no leash, no badge, no uniform could counterfeit. "Get her!" Harris roared, spittle flying from his lips as he jerked his hand forward, the empty leash swinging uselessly. His voice cracked with anger, with disbelief that his command had not been followed. "Attack!" Doyle shouted from behind his flashlight beam, shaking as he jabbed it toward Serena. His boots splashed closer, circling like a jackal, frustrated that the lioness refused to cower. But the canine didn't move. Its muscles quivered, its jaws parted in a growl that stopped short of strike. It circled once, as though caught in a battle deeper than obedience, and then froze its chest, heaving its gaze, flickering between Harris's fury and Serena's steady hand. Serena's voice cut softly through the storm, not a plea, not a cry, but a whisper shaped from memory. She spoke in clipped syllables of foreign tongue that had once carried across desert nights when she steadied the heartbeat of a German shepherd under fire. The rain drowned most of the sound, but the dog heard. Its ears pricked, its tail stiffened, and for a moment its body bowed, head dipping as if waiting not for Harris, but for her. Malik's cries softened, quieting against her chest. Serena pressed her lips to his damp forehead, whispering in the same cadence, the same rhythm she had once used with Ranger, her partner long buried under foreign soil. And in that rhythm, her fear did not rise, it subsided. Because here in this fragile instant, she was not prey. She was command. "Move!" Harris shouted again, his voice climbing into panic. He stomped forward, the puddle splashing high against his uniform. "What's wrong with you? Take her down." But the dog growled low, turning not toward Serena, but toward the officer himself. Its body stiffened, hackles raised, as though the leash had betrayed its true handler. Harris froze, shock splintering across his face. Doyle cursed, shoving past him, his hand reaching for his baton. The clash was no longer between Serena and the dog. It was between fear and command, between arrogance and authority, between the illusion of power and the reality of it. Serena rose slowly from her knee, still shielding Malik with one arm, her free hand never lowering. She stepped forward, once deliberate, her boots splashing in the puddles, her eyes locked on the animals. The dog whined a sound guttural and strange in its vulnerability, before lowering its head slightly, muscles taut but restrained. Doyle swung his baton high, fury boiling in his chest, but Serena's voice cut through again, sharper now, the command clear, undeniable. The canine lunged not at her, but across her body, blocking Doyle's advance, snarling so fiercely that the officer stumbled backward, cursing his weapon, nearly slipping from his grip. Harris shouted, yanking at the leash that dangled uselessly in his fist. "Control your animal." The irony burned hotter than the storm itself. Serena didn't flinch. She didn't break. She stood, soaked, heart-pounding Malik's small breath steady against her collarbone, while the officers realized in growing horror that control had slipped from their hands. The headlights cut sharp beams through the storm, framing a scene no one could have imagined: a black mother kneeling with her infant, her hand raised not in surrender, but in dominance, and a police dog, once weapon now soldier, hesitating at the command of presence alone. The rain fell heavier, drowning the officers' shouts, muffling their fury, but Serena heard them all the same. She could taste their fear in the air, feel their anger crackling like electricity around her. Yet she stood calm, the battlefield carved into her spine, reminding her that discipline beats rage, that presence shatters intimidation. She whispered again, a single word, and the dog's body eased further, circling her protectively, its growl now directed outward at the men who had unleashed it. Malik's tiny fists loosened against her jacket. His cries dissolved into a soft whimper, then into silence. His trust folded entirely into her heartbeat. She bent her head slightly, whispering to him not just reassurance, but a vow that he would never see his mother bow, not to bullets, not to beasts, not to men who mistook suspicion for truth. And in that vow the clash crystallized. The officers shouted louder, veins bulging their fury, growing with every second the dog disobeyed. Their illusion of power fractured before their eyes, and for the first time it was not Serena who trembled, it was them. Their weapons were useless, their intimidation hollow, their authority mocked by the silent obedience of an animal that recognized a truer command. In the storm's roar, Serena stood taller. She knew this was not the end, that Doyle and Harris would escalate, that rage never retreated quietly. But in this moment, this breath suspended between fear and command, she had won the clash. Because control was not in the leash, not in the badge, not in the baton. It was in her. The street quaked with tension, thunder rolling above, as if the storm itself understood the scale of what was unfolding. Serena Cole stood soaked in the downpour, her newborn son pressed firmly against her chest, her free hand steady in the air, like a blade of command cutting through the night. Before her, the first canine, unleashed by Officer Harris with the intent to terrify, stood trembling, no longer lunging at her, no longer obeying his handler's barked orders. Instead, the animal circled her cautiously, ears pricked, eyes locked on Serena, as if recognizing in her presence something deeper than fear. It was a moment Harris could not comprehend. His face twisted, veins bulging at his temple, the leash hanging limp from his hand as if it mocked him. His partner, Officer Doyle, paced behind Serena, his boots splashing water angrily with every step. Fury pulsed from him like heat waves, the disbelief in his eyes igniting into a dangerous decision. His pride had been pierced. The image of control they carried, 2 officers, 2 cruisers, the flashing red and blue lights had cracked wide open because a drenched mother dared to stand unbroken. "Damn it!" Harris Doyle spat, his voice sharp, his tone tinged with desperation. "She's playing you. That mutt's soft. Watch how it's done." Before Harris could respond, Doyle yanked open the rear door of the second cruiser. A fresh snarl ripped into the storm as another canine bounded out larger than the first, its paws splattering mud and water across the pavement. Its teeth flashed in the shifting glow of headlights, its eyes burning with the hunger of discipline, twisted into intimidation. Doyle gripped the leash tight, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched in a grin that had no joy in it, only rage. "This one doesn't hesitate," Doyle hissed, his voice rising above the storm. "Get ready, sweetheart. You're about to learn what control feels like." Serena's heart raced, but not with panic. It was the pounding of readiness, the kind of rhythm her body had memorized from combat zones where hesitation was a death sentence. She adjusted Malik closer, shielding his face from the sudden roar of the second dog. The baby whimpered, but Serena bent her head, pressing her lips to his damp forehead, whispering in a tone meant more for her own soul than his. "I've been here before. We will not break." Doyle unclipped the leash. The second canine surged forward, muscles rippling claws raking the soaked ground as it lunged with a guttural snarl that vibrated in Serena's chest. Harris stepped back, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, certain this would be the strike that ended her defiance. Doyle's lips pulled into a grim smile, the baton in his other hand raised as if victory was moments away. But Serena was not a stranger to this script. She had faced dogs trained sharper than blades, soldiers of fur who sniffed out mines hidden deep beneath desert soil, who charged into gunfire with a courage that rivaled men. She knew the language of their hearts, a language that never left her even after the uniform did. Her voice dropped low, steady, precise. She spoke, not in English, but in the clipped German commands etched into her muscles years ago, words she had whispered in foxholes under fire, words that had steadied Ranger, her partner, when chaos threatened to swallow them whole. Zitz. The sound sliced through the storm softer than the officer's shouting, but sharper than any blade. The second dog's leap faltered mid-air. Its paws struck the pavement with a splash, its body trembling, its growl caught between ferocity and confusion. Rain streaked down its muzzle as it circled, ears twitching violently at her tone. "Bleib." "Stay!" The word rolled from her lips like thunder. The dog froze, chest-heaving, tail-rigid eyes locked not on Doyle, but on her. For a long second, the animal whined, caught in the invisible tug-of-war between the leash of its handler and the leash of memory sparked by her voice. "What the hell are you doing?" Doyle screamed, yanking at the leash, his fury boiling over. He tugged hard, his arm jerking with force, but the dog resisted, muscles straining against him. Its growl deepened, no longer directed at Serena, but at the man who demanded violence. Harris stepped forward, shouting louder, his voice cracking in disbelief. "She's confusing it. Don't let up." But the storm was no longer theirs to control. Both canines now stood within feet of Serena, drenched and trembling in the rain. Their bodies quivered with conflict, their training torn between two worlds. On one side, the harsh orders of men who saw them as tools of intimidation. On the other, the steady hand, the calm authority, the voice of a woman who had once led dogs like them through chaos and fire. Serena lowered her hand slightly, her palm still open, her presence unwavering. Malik had gone silent, his small breath steady against her chest, as though even he sensed that the night balanced on a knife's edge. She spoke again, softer this time, her words a lullaby shaped like command. The first dog whimpered, lowering its head, further ears folding back. The second snarled once more, circling, but its eyes never left hers. Its slowed paws splashing less body bending not toward her, but away. The officers cursed their voices, rising into a storm of panic and rage, but Serena barely heard them. The world narrowed to the animals before her, to the thread of recognition that bound them across years and continents, to the unbreakable truth that authority is not claimed by shouting, it is earned in silence. Doyle, red-faced and seething, raised his baton high. "You think you've won?" he screamed, veins bulging along his neck. He swung it down hard against the hood of the cruiser, the crack echoing like gunfire across the street. The sound jolted the dogs, both flinching, their growls sharp and defensive. But instead of lunging at Serena, they shifted closer to her, their bodies circling, positioning themselves between her and the men who demanded blood. Harris stepped back, his mouth slack with disbelief. "No. No, that's not possible." He muttered, rain streaming down his face. But Serena knew better. She knew what they refused to accept, that power is not born of cruelty, and control is not forged through fear. It was something she had lived, something she had carried back from battlefields where every second of survival depended on trust. And now, on this rain-soaked street, the truth stood undeniable. Two police dogs unleashed as weapons now bowed to her voice, their bodies shields instead of threats. The officers were left with nothing but their rage. Their authority had slipped through their hands like water. Their illusion of control shattered by the quiet, unyielding presence of a woman they had thought helpless. Serena whispered again. Her words meant not just for the animals, but for Malik, for herself, for the world that would one day hear this story. We do not break. We command. And in the silence that followed, heavier than thunder, both dogs lowered themselves into the rain, their heads bowed, their loyalty torn but undeniable. The storm pressed heavier, now sheets of rain tumbling from the black sky, as if the heavens themselves were witnesses to the unraveling of power on this small street in Brookhaven. Serena Cole stood drenched, her jacket clinging to her skin, her newborn son pressed firmly against her chest. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers fractured against puddles at her feet, painting the street in ghostly colors. Moments ago, those colors had felt like a cage. Now they flickered like a stage light exposing truth. Malik stirred, his tiny body trembling against her. His cries sharp and panicked when the dogs first lunged began to soften. The chaos around him did not vanish. Thunder still cracked above. Officers still shouted, and two police dogs still growled in the rain. But he quieted, because he felt what Serena radiated: steadiness, presence, a heartbeat that refused to yield. She pressed her lips to his damp forehead and whispered words shaped not for the officers, not even for the dogs, but for him alone. We are not afraid. The two canines, once snarling weapons of intimidation, stood locked in a strange stalemate. Their bodies quivered, muscles rippling with confusion. Harris shouted, his voice hoarse now, his commands tearing at the storm like jagged glass. Doyle screamed louder, his baton waving in the air, his rage spitting venom into the night. Yet no matter how violently the orders were barked, no matter how hard the leashes jerked, the dogs resisted. One circled Serena slowly, its head dipping lower with each step, its growl softening into something uncertain. The second planted itself before her tail, rigid, its eyes darting between its handler's fury and her calm, commanding posture. They weren't defying instinct. They were following it. And instinct told them this woman was no prey. She was authority. Serena felt it in her bones, the same way she had once felt Rangers' trust in war zones, where bullets tore the air apart. Authority wasn't loud. Authority wasn't violent. Authority was presence, steady, grounded, unbreakable. And in that moment, she understood something even deeper. The very animals meant to break her had revealed what the men holding their leashes could not admit, that the true leader in this confrontation was not them. It was her. She inhaled deeply, drawing strength from every scar her past had carved into her. When she exhaled, she let her voice fall low, steady, controlled. She spoke again in German, the syllables crisp, despite the rain, each one a thread pulling tighter, the invisible leash between her and the animals. "Sitz! Sit!" Both dogs faltered. One whimpered softly, circling back until it stood beside her, its chest heaving, but its body lowering, sinking into the soaked pavement. The second bristled, growled once, as if in protest, then bowed its head, ears, twitching tail stiff, before easing down into the puddles. The sight was staggering, not two beasts lunging in violence, but 2 soldiers bowing to her authority. The air thickened with silence. Not the silence of calm, but the silence that comes when the ground beneath power shifts. Officer Harris stumbled back a step, his jaw slack, his hand twitching uselessly against the leash that dangled like a broken chain. Officer Doyle's eyes widened, rage colliding with fear in his gaze, his baton shaking as his grip weakened. "What the hell?" Harris muttered, his voice cracking. "Why won't they?" "They're trained," Doyle snapped, though his tone wavered, betraying disbelief. They don't just stop." But they had stopped. Not only stopped, they had turned. Their bodies no longer positioned as weapons for the officers, but as shields for Serena. Their eyes locked on her with a recognition that pierced through years, through continents, through uniforms discarded and medals forgotten. Serena rose taller, her spine straight, her soaked hair plastered against her cheeks. She did not scream, did not threaten. She stood. That was enough. She let the storm cloak her, the rain dripping from her outstretched hand, her son nestled quiet against her. And in that posture the revelation burned clear: the badge did not make these men leaders. The leash did not make them masters. Their rage did not command obedience. The dogs knew it. She knew it. And now, judging by the flicker in their eyes, Harris and Doyle knew it too. Malik let out a soft sigh, drifting into uneasy silence, his small body surrendering to her steadiness. Serena lowered her head slightly, whispering again, not commands this time, but a vow. "You will not remember your mother broken. You will remember her unshaken." The officers shouted again, but the sound no longer carried weight. The dogs ignored them, their ears twitching only when Serena shifted her stance. Their loyalty had reoriented, their allegiance exposed. It was no accident, no coincidence. It was truth rising in the rain. Doyle's fury flared hotter. He stomped forward, baton raised, ready to swing at the dogs themselves if that's what it took. But when he lifted his weapon, both canines snarled, not at Serena, not at Malik, but at him. The sound was primal, protective, their bodies rigid as they planted themselves between Serena and his rage. The baton hovered mid-air, Doyle's arm trembling as realization cut into him he was no longer in control. Fear flickered in his eyes. Real fear. Harris cursed under his breath, his voice shaking with frustration. He tugged at the leash in his fist, but the dog refused to move. This isn't possible," he whispered, though the storm carried his words to every ear on that street. But Serena knew it was not only possible, it was inevitable. She had lived long enough to understand that illusions of power crumble when truth steps forward. And tonight, truth had arrived not in the form of a weapon, not in the uniform of authority, but in the drenched silhouette of a mother standing unbroken in the rain. The revelation settled heavy in the air. The officers' hands twitched near their belts, their pride shattering with every second that the dogs refused them. Their authority, built on intimidation and fear, had slipped like water through their fingers, and in its place stood Serena, steady, silent, commanding. She spoke one final word, softer than thunder, sharper than lightning. The dogs responded instantly, shifting closer, their bodies curved protectively around her like sentinels. The officers froze, their fury strangled by disbelief, their confidence smothered by the sight of loyalty they could never purchase or demand. And for the first time that night, Serena allowed herself to feel the weight of the revelation she was not at their mercy. They were at hers. The storm roared on, but within its fury a fragile silence stretched across the street, one that carried a message far beyond Brookhaven, far beyond that rain-soaked night. Authority is not worn. It is not shouted. It is not unleashed on leashes. Authority is presence, and presence cannot be stolen by fear. And as Harris and Doyle exchanged panicked glances, the realization etched itself deeper in their eyes. The woman they had tried to corner was not weak. She was the leader they would never be. The storm raged overhead, lightning splitting the night like jagged glass thunder rolling so heavy it rattled the very street beneath their feet. Serena Cole stood at the center of it, drenched to the bone, her newborn son pressed firmly against her chest. The two police dogs flanked her like sentinels, their bodies stiff, their ears alert, their growls vibrating through the air. They were no longer snarling at her. They were snarling at the men who held their leashes, the very men who had unleashed them with the intent to break her spirit. Officer Harris's face was a mask of disbelief. His hand trembled as he reached for the leash dangling uselessly in his fist, as though tugging hard enough might reassert control. But the dog's body resisted its muscles, locked its growl low and warning. Harris cursed spittle flying from his lips, veins bulging at his neck, as the truth he had spent years avoiding clawed into him. He was not in charge. Not anymore. Behind Serena, Officer Doyle's fury boiled hotter. His pride had already been shredded by the sight of his canine, bowing to her voice, by the revelation that authority wasn't his to claim. Rage made his movements clumsy. His baton shook in his grip as he lifted it higher, rain dripping down the metal. His teeth bared like an animal about to strike. But Serena's voice cut through the storm. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. Her words came low, steady, carved with steel and memory, carrying the weight of deserts halfway across the world, and the authority that comes not from force, but from presence. The German syllables slid from her tongue like old songs commands once whispered in foxholes, now resurrected in the rain. The dogs responded instantly. Their growls deepened, their bodies pivoting not toward her, but toward the men behind the weapons. Their fur-bristled tails, stiff eyes gleaming with the recognition of a leader worth following. The sound that rose from their throats was no longer intimidation aimed at Serena, it was protection aimed at her. Doyle froze mid-swing, the baton raised high. One of the canines snarled so viciously, his arm quivered, hesitation slicing through his rage. Harris staggered backward, his hand fumbling near his holster, fingers twitching dangerously close to his gun. But the animals saw it. They lunged half a step forward, stopping him cold. For the first time in their careers, the officers felt what it was to stand on the receiving end of their own weapons. Serena adjusted Malik higher against her chest, his tiny body silent now, his head tucked beneath her chin, as though even he understood that his mother had turned fear into power. The rain plastered her hair across her cheeks, but her eyes burned with clarity. She was no longer simply defending herself. She was standing as revelation, the very tools designed to oppress her had become her guardians. "Don't you dare!" Doyle spat, his baton still raised, though his voice betrayed the tremor in his chest. His bravado cracked. The growls cut deeper than the storm, rattling his confidence, until sweat mixed with the rain dripping down his temple. Harris's panic twisted into something more dangerous. His hand hovered closer to his gun, the weight of humiliation pushing him toward escalation. He couldn't stand the sight of obedience slipping away, of control shattering before his eyes. His badge, his weapon, his uniform, all of it meant nothing in the face of a drenched black woman commanding loyalty, with nothing more than her presence. "You don't run?" This Harris shouted, his voice breaking. He yanked at the leash again, but the dog only pressed closer to Serena, snarling louder, its chest vibrating like a drumbeat against the rain. Serena's voice steadied, calm but unyielding. She whispered another command in German, softer than thunder, but sharper than lightning. The dogs froze, then shifted their bodies, planting more firmly between her and the men who wanted to crush her. The reversal was absolute. Harris and Doyle had unleashed these animals, believing they would tear Serena down, believing she would crumble under fear. Instead, they now stared at their own reflection in the beast's eyes, weak men who mistook cruelty for strength, who mistook intimidation for control. And those illusions had collapsed. Serena's heart thundered, but not from panic. It was the rhythm of resolve. She had lived through worse. She had walked through fields where every step could have been her last trusted dogs to lead her past death itself. Tonight, she trusted that same truth presence commands where violence fails. Malik stirred, letting out a soft sigh, his tiny fists unclenching. Serena pressed her lips to his head again and whispered, so only he could hear, "You see this, my son. They cannot break what we are." Doyle's baton wavered. Harris's hand twitched at his holster. The storm raged, but the silence between them grew heavier than thunder. Because they all knew the power dynamic had flipped. It wasn't the officers who held control anymore. It was the mother they had tried to break. The dogs, their supposed weapons of fear, now stood as her protectors, their growls vibrating like a promise that no harm would touch her or the fragile life in her arms. Authority had not just shifted. It had been ripped from their hands, entirely exposed for what it was, an illusion that shattered under the weight of true command. Serena took a step forward, slow and deliberate. The dogs moved with her, their bodies aligned with hers, their loyalty undeniable. The officers stumbled back instinctively, their pride bleeding into fear, their threats reduced to silence, by the sight of the very animals they controlled guarding the woman they sought to destroy. And in that moment, Serena understood the depth of it. This wasn't just survival. This was revelation. This was oppression turned into protection, injustice turned into justice, fear turned into awe. She had not only shielded her child, she had dismantled their illusion of power, without lifting a weapon, without raising her voice. The storm howled, but the truth was louder. Strength was hers, and for the first time it was the officers, not the mother, who looked cornered. The rain had softened from a punishing torrent to a steady curtain, but the storm's weight still lingered thick in the air, heavy on every breath. Serena Cole rose slowly from her crouch, water dripping from her soaked hair, her body aching from the tension of the night. She was exhausted, her muscles burning, her arms trembling from holding Malik so tightly. And yet, though her frame quivered, though fatigue gnawed at her bones, she stood unbroken. Her spine straightened like iron forged in fire, her eyes steady as the streetlights flickered against the downpour. She bent her head, whispering into the tiny ear pressed against her collarbone. Malik stirred, his breaths uneven, but calm, his tiny hands gripping the fabric of her jacket with the unconscious trust only a child could hold. "You will not remember your mother broken," she murmured, her voice carrying like a vow through the rain. "You will grow knowing she stood, that she did not bow, not tonight, not ever." The words were not just a promise to her son. They were a covenant with herself. She had fought wars in deserts halfway across the world, commanded dogs that sniffed out mines, and death carried comrades to safety when the air itself reeked of blood and dust. She had endured silence when she returned home, jobs denied respect, withheld her service forgotten, because her skin spoke louder than her medals. But tonight, on this rain-soaked street in Brookhaven, she had reclaimed what no one could erase: her authority, her dignity, her strength. The dogs stood flanking her, their bodies rigid, their ears twitching, their growls still vibrating low and steady. They were not confused anymore. They had chosen, and their choice was clear. They were her guardians now, not the officers. Soldiers in fur aligned by instinct with the leader who commanded presence, not fear. Officer Harris stood frozen, his hand still twitching near his holster, but refusing to close the distance. His mouth worked, but no sound emerged, his pride strangled by disbelief. Officer Doyle clutched his baton tightly, but it dangled now lowered by trembling fingers. Their fury had collapsed into something neither man could admit: a loud fear. Not fear of her body, not fear of her baby, but fear of what she represented: authority that could not be bought, bullied, or bound by a badge. Serena took her first step forward. The puddle rippled beneath her boot, the sound louder than their silence. The canines shifted with her, their bodies moving in sync, their eyes never straying from her. The officers staggered back instinctively, the way men retreat when they realize power has left them entirely. Step by step she walked past them. The cruiser's headlights still glared, painting halos of white against the storm. The red and blue lights still flashed, refracting across wet asphalt like shattered glass. But their meaning had changed. What had been a cage an hour earlier was now nothing more than fading neon, a weak backdrop to the silhouette of a woman who had transformed intimidation into revelation. Harris whispered something to Doyle, but Serena didn't hear. Or maybe she refused to. Their words no longer mattered. They were fragments of a power that no longer existed, echoes of a command that had been stripped bare. The only sounds she allowed into her bones were the soft breaths of her child, the steady rhythm of rain, and the low growls of dogs who had chosen to protect rather than destroy. As she passed them, Doyle lifted his baton half-heartedly, as if to reclaim what had been lost. But the dogs shifted instantly, snapping their heads toward him, their bodies rigid with threat. He froze his arm, falling limply to his side, shame carved across his soaked face. Harris's hand twitched at his gun again, but even he knew the truth. Drawing it now would not restore authority. It would expose desperation. And desperation was weaker than silence. Serena walked on. The block stretched ahead, lined with dark houses, curtains drawn tight. But she knew eyes were watching. Somewhere behind those windows, neighbors who had whispered too loudly earlier were now silent. Their stares pressed against glass, bearing witness to a story they would never forget. They would say later that they hadn't seen clearly, that the rain blurred their vision, that the night distorted their memory. But deep down, every person on that street would remember they saw two armed officers disarmed by presence alone. They saw dogs trained for violence bow to a drenched mother who refused to break. They saw power crack like lightning in the sky. Serena's steps grew steadier, her exhaustion bending into resolve. Malik stirred again, releasing a small sigh, and she pressed another kiss to his forehead. The warmth of his tiny body grounded her, reminding her why she had stood at all. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for him, for the fragile life that deserved to inherit a world where mothers did not have to shield their children from weapons meant to silence them. The dogs remained at her side until the cruiser's lights faded behind her, until the storm softened from roar to drizzle, until the street itself seemed to exhale. Only then did she pause, turning her head slightly, as if to etch the image into her memory, two officers standing in stunned silence, their weapons useless, their illusions shattered. It was not triumph she felt, but clarity. A revelation she had lived her entire life, but had never seen so plainly reflected in the eyes of her oppressors. Strength misjudged is strength unleashed. She whispered it aloud, her voice carrying into the rain. "You don't know me, but you will remember me." And she kept walking, Every step was heavy, but every step was also history. The kind of history that would echo far beyond Brookhaven, beyond the wet street where headlights once cornered her. It was the history of a truth revealed in the simplest, rawest form. Authority is not claimed by fear. It is revealed in presence. By the time Serena disappeared into the night, her apartment lights glowing faintly in the distance, the storm had become little more than mist. Her silhouette, small yet unyielding, faded into the darkness with her child safe in her arms, and two dogs left behind as reluctant witnesses to the unraveling of their handler's control. Her story was no longer her own. It was a symbol, a reminder that the underestimated carry the kind of strength that can silence beasts, shatter illusions, and rewrite destiny itself. And in that rain-drenched town on that ordinary night, turned battlefield history had been rewritten by the quiet authority of a mother who refused to bow. On a rain-soaked street in Brookhaven, one woman's courage revealed a truth that America too often forgets. Strength misjudged is strength unleashed. Serena Cole, a 32-year-old veteran and new mother, stood unarmed, carrying nothing but her newborn child, and the authority born from discipline, sacrifice, and love. Two officers, armed with badges, batons, guns, and two canine dogs, thought they could reduce her to fear. But instead, the very animals meant to destroy her turned into her protectors, recognizing her true command. That moment is not just a story, it is a lesson for every American. It shows us that power rooted in intimidation is fragile, while power rooted in integrity and presence cannot be broken. It reminds us that the measure of a nation is not in how it treats the strong, but in how it respects the dignity of the vulnerable. It warns us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that every citizen must demand accountability from those sworn to serve and protect. And it challenges us to see beyond uniforms, beyond assumptions, beyond prejudice, to recognize the humanity and authority in those who are too often overlooked. Serena's stand is more than survival. It is revelation, a call to all of us, to rise, to speak, to act, to ensure that no mother, no father, no child ever faces such injustice again. So here is where you come in. If you believe stories like this must be told, if you believe America cannot look away from its own reflection, then stand with us. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that reveals hidden truths. Hit that like button. It takes less than 2 seconds, but it tells the world that courage deserves to be amplified. Share this video with your family, your neighbors, your community, because every share is a spark, and enough sparks can light a fire that changes the future. We cannot wait for someone else to act. The time is now. The responsibility is ours. Together we can turn stories into movements, moments into change. Let Serena's courage be the beginning of something larger. Subscribe, like, share, and let's walk into history together.